Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about design research and voting. On today's episode, I have a fascinating conversation with Alicia Cheng about her great new book, This is What Democracy Looked Like, a visual history of the printed ballot. This book is a richly illustrated look at how printed ballots in the United States has evolved over this country's history, but this is not just a book that's about typography or illustration or paper stocks. What Alicia does so well here is use these artifacts, use these designed objects to tell a larger story, a story about democracy, but also a story about how this country has had an uneasy relationship with voting and how we've made it easier in some ways while also making it harder in other ways. This book, fortunately and unfortunately, is perfectly timed as we head to the polls when the president of the United States is already trying to delegitimize the election, to stop people from voting, to make voting harder for people, to try to sabotage the post office so you can't mail in your ballot. But what Alicia shows in this book, and I hope comes across in this conversation, is the importance of voting and how throughout this country's history we have seen things like this before, and why that's important to make it easier for as many people to vote as possible. And that, in some ways, is a design problem. So if you haven't voted yet, do it. Find out if you can vote early in your state and go. Find out where your polling place is. If you'll be voting next week, do it early if you can. And most importantly, do it safely. Alicia and I begin this conversation talking about the book and talking about what she learned through the process, both about design history, but also American history. Alicia is a graphic designer by trade. She's the founding partner of a New York design studio management, which is stylized MGMT, which you hear me accidentally refer to it like that in the conversation a few times. And we talk about approaching this book from a designer's perspective as opposed to a historian or a researcher's perspective, and how this project intersected with the studio's work and the role of research in her larger practice. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoyed this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that is written by me that includes bonus content, exclusive interviews, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me, and it really helps keep the podcast going. For all the details and to sign up, all you have to do is go to scratchingthesurface.fm/members. That's scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for your support and for listening, and enjoy this really thoughtful conversation with Alicia Cheng. I really want to start with the origins of this project and where this project came from, because it seems like a really massive undertaking. So you have this semi-new book now at this point. This is What Democracy Looked Like, a visual history of the printed ballot. And in this book, you kind of go through, really almost the entire history of the United States and look at the evolution of ballot design. How'd this start? Where did this idea come from for you?
I will fully credit the eminent historian Jill Lepore, who wrote a piece in the New Yorker. It was October '08. And she wrote about sort of like early voting practices, where it was not a private process and voters risked, their lives to show up at the polls, and that they were holding colorful ballots. And the whole article was super fascinating to me. Just learning things I never knew about sort of the history of how our participatory democracy worked in the early days. But the colorful ballot thing really struck my eye. I was like, what does this possibly mean? So, the internet then did not really have too much to offer in terms of visual examples. There was maybe a few things. And then one thing led to another. I was feeling, I don't know, I just reached out to her, and she happened to be in New York, and we had coffee together, which was amazing. She was already back then pretty busy. He encouraged me to pursue it as an endeavor. Unfortunately, not able to write for it per se, but just said there were some private collectors or different libraries that I should just sort of see what I could find. And so it was like one of those big ticket projects that you put on the back burner, like whenever I have free time from work, I'll do this. And of course, it didn't really proceed very far. And then life happened, but in 2016, I was really kind of reeling after the election results and was, resolved to sort of seek refuge in history to see if our republic had survived something
Mm.
like this, because surely I thought we have had seen, if not worse, something close to it. So that started just like simple research at the New York Public Library, just sitting in the Rose reading room, which is an incredibly inspiring space. And just sort of checking out books in and around sort of ballot design and history of. It was
Mhm.
super general and like really idle. I wasn't aiming for a book. I wasn't aiming to encapsulate the whole like visual history at that moment. But it built on itself where I was found myself in LA, and there's a huge collection at the Huntington Museum, which I
Mm.
highly recommend going
Mhm.
there. Have you
Mhm.
been there in Pasadena?
I'm familiar with it, but I have not actually been there yet.
It's like has been. It's like a botanical garden, it's a museum,
Right.
it's a historic house, and it's a library. And so I went there and, applied for reading privileges. It was pretty straightforward. And, found myself being given these sort of boxes of political ephemera. And it was so viscerally so exciting to just pour through all of this paper ephemera from like late 1700s, 1800s,
Mhm.
no reason, it was just available to me. And it was super exciting. And that really galvanized the effort to sort of capture this and share it, to the world. And whether or not it was going to be a book or a website or an exhibition, all of those things that, as a designer, I was familiar with how one gets the content to that state, which was not an easy task. I had no illusions that I would hit a 2020 anything mark, really. Um, so I was sort of plodding along, like doing research in different places. Another big source was the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass, which were super
Mhm.
helpful. So all of these visits were just the most exciting kind of things where I just didn't really know what I was asking for, but just sort of looking to see what they had under the heading of ballots, 18th century, 19th century. So that part was just super exciting, and to sort of feel and see the physical artifact in hand is something I always talk about, especially to like students, to say that,
Right.
you can see it online, and it's many of them now have been digitized, but there's something totally different about holding it in your hand, feeling the texture of the paper and the tactility, and seeing like the pencil marks of somebody from, 1889. So that part is really kind of almost chilling. Um, and then, one thing led to another, and somebody's like, you should really get out there and do something with this. So
Yeah.
I emailed our friend Nicholas Bleckman at New Yorker, saying,
Mm.
"Do you have any ideas about where this could, be shown?" And he said, "Oh, maybe we would do something about it." I was like, "We?" He went to New Yorker, so that was really exciting and completely freaked me out. So he posted a online piece for midterms. I
Mm.
think that was this is where I don't know the year. I'll have to look that up. But midterms in November, and that kind of put it
Mhm.
out there. So then I was felt more emboldened to like go to Princeton Architecture Press, who we had a relationship with, to be like, "What do you think about this idea?" And
Right.
that's what really lit the fire of like, you know what, I think we can do this for 2020. And then it was just bonkers. Like, you
Yeah.
know, as you know, as an author, also
Yeah.
sort of like
Yeah.
cramming sort of, I felt like a history master's, self-taught, to sort of write at least some framing essay, sort of look for contributors to help frame it further, and then, try to get the content in a way that was suitable for reproduction. So all of that happened really fast. I'm not sorry we did it, because I feel like at this moment too, in so many ways, it's become something that everyone is really focused on. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's good timing in a way, but I think it's just everyone is primed to receive this in a really great way.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that kind of idea about this being an important book for this time. But I have one other question. You said something else in there that I thought was interesting that I want to ask you first about that kind of publishing it in the New Yorker and then that kind of cram to get it out. And obviously at management, you are a very kind of research focused studio, I
Mhm.
think. But had you ever done this broad and deep of research before, or like, do you consider yourself a historian? What
Oh
was
God,
that?
no. I mean, I make that very clear because, you're wading into what is clearly not like a quote unquote design field, right? You're like
Yeah,
learning about
right,
American history. And, I took civics in high school, like I kind of knew the general outlay, but then suddenly you're really going deep and sort of like, electoral process back then, the effect of
right,
sort of like, voter emancipation, universal suffrage, like you're getting into it in a great way. But
hmm
I never thought that I would go deep in that way. I mean, before I was a designer, I was more of like an English major, more academically minded, but I had never
okay,
done anything, this specific in terms of historical research in that way. I mean, what I
yeah,
think was freeing for me from our curatorial standpoint was that I wasn't really looking for the ballot that represented, the election of, Rutherford B. Hayes in 18. So
right,
I was just looking for kind of cool stuff. And like with that design eyeballs, you're like, this is awesome. I don't really, it's less about representing, California and Midwest and the East Coast. It was
right,
so that was freeing in that way from a curatorial standpoint. But I did love the research and the academic quality of it and sort of all the writing and, footnotes and all that. Like it takes time. Like,
yeah.
I'm no Robert Caro, but I can totally appreciate these things take years. So maybe it's a blessing, obviously, to sort of really light the fire and get it done quickly. But, in better circumstances, I would have loved to sort of like, revel in just being able to kind of luxuriate in a topic and just learn things. So that was like one of the best byproducts of the process for sure.
I mean, it's interesting. You talk about the writing the captions and the image descriptions, and what was kind of fun for me in the book, and in reading it, and I read all of the captions. I think I read every word in the
Oh,
book,
thanks.
uh, and we know each other a little bit, but not that well. But every time I've kind of been with you and we've talked, you kind of radiate this energy and a sense of humor, and that all came through in the book too. Was
Oh,
that a kind
great.
of conscious choice? Like the captions had jokes in them, and there were like little kind of subtle humor throughout. Was that kind of a conscious decision, or is that just like that's who you are, that's how you write, and that's just
Well,
what
it
happened?
is funny. Thanks for commenting on that for sure. And when you have to like write something that's more sort of conversational versus say that first sort of assignment as being for the New Yorker, suddenly you get very, again, academic in a not a great way. It becomes a little bit
Right.
stilted and stiff, and here are the facts. And then I just kind of I was doing a lot of reading of different historians that whose voices I really liked, like Jill Lepore,
Mm.
Robert Caro writing about process. I became really interested in reading about historians writing about history and the
Hmm.
that they take because it is so speculative. So, I didn't want to sort of write things in such a definitive way because I was so self-conscious about not being a historian. So,
Right.
in a way, like not defaulting, but sort of introducing a more I wouldn't say casual per se, but a voice that was like, not meant to be like, and this happened because,
Right.
no one really knows. And it's still much more compelling and it's a greater story if you sort of, introduce it more colorfully and not so pedantically. So, yeah, so that part was fun, but writing is hard. It's really
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. You don't have to tell me
No,
that.
no, full well. So, that's what I mean about sort of the time it takes. Like you just massage and massage like one paragraph, especially when you are trying to leapfrog from fact to fact. Um, it's hard. So that was another also great exercise where it wasn't just about the ballot. It became about, you know, the electoral process in general, the growing population, the immigration stances, the sort of, the rise of the restoration period, and like all of that directly affected what ballots looked like. So I was tying in sort of the broader stroke American history movements with a lot of the stuff I was seeing. And like, you read history and sort of see recurrent names of, not, presidential candidates, but sort of gubernatorial candidates. And, I was starting to see the trends that were coming together within the artifacts, that was super exciting. Another huge tie-in, which was really thrilling, was a look at how they were produced. Paper production,
Right.
changing from linen to wood, fundamentally changed the distribution methods and people being able to have a little more free time rather than just like farming to stay alive, and like all these things it was just like this massive multi-layered kind of Venn diagram, and the very middle was the ballot. So that part, it was hugely stimulating and exciting, but also like really overwhelming to try to sort of refer to that within the text that I did have. So
Well, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned earlier that you kind of treating this as a design project, or thinking about this as the kind of history of the visuals of these, and you have that, and they're interesting, and they're fun to look at, and some of them are silly, and some of them are very kind of serious, and you can see how they uh relate or have led to what ballots look like today. But what was really interesting to me was this larger story that you kind of embed either, I guess, beneath those visuals.
mhm,
And my favorite type of design history book is the design history book that looks at these artifacts and says, all right, what can these artifacts tell us about that time, or
mhm,
tell us about some kind of broader
yeah,
thing? And that's what you're doing here. And what was really interesting to me is it's we're kind of in this moment right now where we're voting, we're talking about the importance of voting. There's everything going on with like the post office and,
mhm,
mail-in voting, and the how hard voting can be and
mhm,
is for people. And what's interesting is that's kind of embedded in this book throughout the entire history,
yeah,
is making voting hard. And I'm thinking specifically of that one ballot that was like 14 feet long or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, yeah.
Can you talk about how you started to tell that story in relationship to the actual physical ballots, and how those ballots then kind of show this really uneasy relationship between kind of government and voting?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the main things that I discovered just through sort of broadly reading about, the rise, say, of Andrew Jackson and sort of common
Mm-hmm.
man, and like how offices became more elected versus appointed. All of that meant more elections, meant more people voting, and more, ballots needed. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, ballots always being a reflection of how that electoral evolution has, and the sort of pathology of democracy has evolved. I mean, it's kind of cold comfort to say, like, we're so outraged at the sort of level of corruption and outright sort of bad behavior of our current administration. But I don't know what to say, but it was worse before. Like, if you look at, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously we all are more familiar potentially with like the whole Boss Tweed uh,
Oh yeah.
corruption from like gangs of New York or whatever. But even before that, the whole nature of how one casts one ballot is sort of founded on, once things really become, it's all rests in the power of the political parties, which is hard to kind of understand, that if you imagine that all your ballots are produced by a Republican or Democratic Party,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems like sort of blatantly partisan. But that's another sort of broader history that gets embedded with this sort of context, is sort of the history of political parties and partisanship. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's why I had to keep broadening it out without getting lost in that narrative, and still keeping it focused on the ballot. Um, but yeah, I mean, just to say, the issues of like power and corruption are, consistent themes throughout our history. I mean, there are so many
Yeah.
things that I didn't include that they were like off topic from the ballot, but like, newspaper accounts of like drunken senators casting votes on the children's bill. Like, I mean, the
Nice.
violence that used to occur when they used to bring, firearms to the Senate floor. Like, it's
Right.
all, you're like, you know what? There is progress.
I guess my question, or I guess kind of what I'm really curious about in the kind of structure and organization of the book, is how you thought about making sure that it always came back to the ballot
Mm,
itself. That you are a graphic designer. This, we can say, is a kind of book of design history, or of kind of like visual history. Um, it's very richly illustrated. How did you think about the best way to tell this larger narrative without losing focus of, but this is actually about these objects also? You know what I mean?
yes, I do, and I would say my short answer is a very good editor. Abby Boosel and Sarah Stemmons at Pitts Architecture Press, they were so supportive and awesome. And my first draft was just like, it was, huge and fatty and had everything. I mean, I could, because each one of these weren't really, I didn't see them as tangents per se, but like there was a whole huge chapter on like ballot boxes and what I found about that, or, voting machines. And, they kept saying, keep it to the ballot, because there were so many like amazing stories that I felt, were not irrelevant, but less relevant. So I think keeping it on track with, I could credit my editors at PAP. I can credit my husband and other readers who were gently trying to help me focus on the ballot, because it was just all, it all seemed relevant. So I think that's also funny because, as a designer of exhibitions, sometimes you work with collectors. And, when you're trying to get them to say narrow down their checklist and they're trying to be like, oh, but they all matter. And you're like, ugh, they all look the same. It was the same for me because I also had to edit down the number of ballots that I could fit in the page count. And I turned into one of those people that's like, oh no, but I really love this one. So I saw both sides of the coin in terms of content generation and design.
I'm not sure if there's a question here. I'm going to just talk a little bit and see see if something comes out, because there's something that I'm thinking about, and kind of hearing you talk about the process is I'm thinking about kind of my own history with voting and ballots and thinking about this, and my kind of first paying attention to the design of ballots, which I probably think, unfortunately, a lot of people's was the butterfly ballot in 2000. And that is like the prime case of design gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I already mentioned the like 14-foot ballot,
Mm-hmm.
which was my favorite thing in your book.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in your research. Did you find other things like that where the design itself was either intentionally or unintentionally, like backfired, I guess? So like I guess what I'm trying to say is like the butterfly ballot was just kind of poorly designed, a bad user interface. The 14-foot ballot is also a bad user interface, but probably on purpose to make it so people couldn't vote, or it would be hard to vote. How I mean, like, how common is that? Is that more pervasive than we realize? Are there other examples of that you were able to find?
There are other examples, but it's also interesting to note that where, there aren't the examples that I found in my research aren't always fully embodied in the ballot itself. Like the 14th is a great statement in and of itself, but that's why, going back to the digression part, like, deliberate voter suppression happened in the form of, ballots that were really hard to read for people who were less literate, or you had to submit them, not in one ballot box, but several. So they would have one box for every office, and they would switch the order every now and then to confuse. Like every step of the way was, sort of laid with different kind of opportunities for corruption. Like setting a voter registration date on a Jewish holiday when people, had to observe the Sabbath. So subtle but consistent ways where there are a lot of suppressive, corrupt practices that aren't always embodied in the ballot as an artifact, but are fully embodied in the electoral process as a whole.
Right.
I know. Sorry,
right.
It's totally depressing, because you can be like, a better ballot, then everyone can vote. It's like, well, yes, but now everyone's learning. Like it depends on the mail system, and also let's talk about the printers who are trying to print things, and the envelopes and supply and demand and all those things that we all know about from a design and production standpoint. Those all matter too.
I mean, you started answering exactly what my next question was going to be, and I was curious about how this research, if it changed how you think about the voting process and maybe even ballot design specifically today. And you already said you are kind of heartened by the outrage that's happening right now, and kind of saying like, you know what, it was also worse before. There's obviously questions about like digital ballots and the security there, and you kind of mention in the book that paper ballots are kind of perhaps here to stay for a while. What do you think about right now? How does this connect to that history? Is there a, I'm not telling you to speculate or to be a futurist, but is there a way forward here, even from a kind of visual design standpoint?
I think not so much the way forward for me. I think the research for me has certainly taught me to appreciate and be more sympathetic to the enormous challenges that we face. Not, and it's not again about the layout of the ballot, which
Right.
is a factor for sure, but just sort of the scale in which our democracy is sort of sick as it is now. But as it functions with the number of people and managing a population of our scale, it's amazing it functions at all. So I think it's
Right.
not from a perspective of like, reading closely about managing all the influx of all the immigrants coming at a certain, period, the endemic racism that happens then too. So in many ways, we are, functioning at a higher level than we deserve to be potentially. Um,
Hmm.
so I think ultimately it's more sympathetic to the enormous challenges facing us today. And I think just, from my standpoint, having done a few events with like the Brennan Center, who's actively involved in sort of voter legislation and sort of helping improve sort of election administration aspects, like that, I feel is a place where, hoping that there can be more funding and more awareness of getting better people who are managing that system too. Like, it's not so sexy to be a poll worker.
Right.
Maybe we should privilege that more. So these are clearly, broad systemic changes that would be good to see. And on a like
Right.
lay level, I signed up to be a election inspector. It's not,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
I'm kind of frankly a little bit tired of like making posters. I know that's something we can do, but I feel like I don't know how else to sort of actively get your hands dirty in that way, which feels like we need hands on deck to do that, no matter what your background. So
Right.
I also give a website to folks. It's called 866ourvote.org. You can go and get training and then be sort of more of a hotline for voters to ask questions about, where they can get their ballot or sort of a general sort of information hotline. So that kind of thing. I mean, in a non-pandemic time, I would definitely consider like driving to Ohio or Pennsylvania or working with phone banks, or that's the kind of thing that I think we can't think that that's we need to see that as a really viable option this time because it's a critical moment.
Yeah, and it's like it's interesting, and I was trying to. This is like starting to get to the question that I was kind of trying to phrase earlier, where these these issues, it's easy to frame them as design
Yeah,
issues. It's like, oh, if we just had a better ballot design, that would do it. But that's not true. That might be like a little step, but that's not actually really the big problem here.
no, that's exactly right. And I get a little miffed at my own tribe by sort of thinking that maybe that would be, such a key component. And it's obviously a key component within many key components. So,
Mhm.
I'll say
Right.
it is a matter of design, but it's more with like a capital D, like a design of the whole kind of system. So let's not
Right.
get too enamored of like what typeface looks best. Clearly, that's a factor when you have things like the butterfly, and then there's many horrifying examples, coincidentally all from Florida. Screen issues of like, putting the instructions on, within the columns, so, just people just misvoting because of just like poor layout. So, that to me uh, is a simple thing of you're making a county clerk be the art director. Like that's
Right.
so not to, and that's when I would say yes, a designer should be part of that process. Doesn't have to be like the savior, but it can certainly help a lot in terms of we're totally used to designing under specific parameters and keeping things all those specifications. So I think
Yeah.
trying to incorporate a design link in that chain, I think would be a key improvement. I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I was thinking about I think a lot about kind of the design history canon
Mhm,
and what when we teach students design history, what we show them,
mhm,
and I'm very interested in not just showing them. This is a little bit of a tangent, by the way. Not just showing them like the posters from the mid-century modernists and showing them, kind of postmodernists postmodernism in the 90s and stuff, but like actually showing this ephemera
Mhm.
also, and that like, hey, this is a design thing too, and that's an option to think about, in your future also. And
Mhm.
I don't know if I have anything to say other than that I agree with you that that is a part of it and that is helpful, but also kind of keeping in mind that that's not the end
Yeah, it's a sort of.
of it.
We did a project, my studio. We did a project with the AIGA for design relief after Hurricane Sandy, and it was a really engaging, eye-opening process where we were working directly with communities to sort of see what they needed. That was the brief was that broad. So going to a lot of community meetings and listening to what they needed, it was ended up being sort of more of a communication system whereby they could go to this place called the Red Hook Hub and know that that would be verified information and also opportunities for community to post information. So the graphic design of that whole project in the end was like trade Gothic on 100% yellow. That was it. It was like no time to do it.
Yeah.
But the process was the design process too. So it is about you can call it UX UI, but sort of the audience, what they need from it, and the context within which it lives is so key to not it. It's very little about being sort of the portfolio shot. So.
Right, exactly. And that connects exactly to where I wanted to take this conversation, because I was really interested in how this book and this process relates, intersects with, overlaps the work with your studio. And so since you're a co-founder and partner at MGMT since 2001, I think, right? So almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Is that right? Um, how did this, did you see this as kind of a separate project? How does this kind of relate to the more, what I'm going to call traditional design work, which I'm putting traditional in quotes, but the kind of studio practice?
Right.
How did this connect to that?
Well, I mean, one huge, piece of credit can go to Sarah Gephardt, my partner,
Mhm.
who was supportive throughout this whole thing. Because, I was sort of running off, taking a couple days here and there to go to different libraries, and she was just like super supportive. And so, in that way, I think having that flexibility was hugely helpful and sort of figuring out how to incorporate. And, as the studio was formed, it has always been founded on a principle of sort of creative collaboration and flexibility. We started it
Mhm.
when we were all like working like crazy for other people. And we're like, this is not sustainable. We need to do it for ourselves. And if we're going to do it for ourselves, we might as well take, the flexibility where we can. So,
Right.
we took time off to have our kids, and this too sort of fell within that sort of time off to do research. So I think it was a natural extension that we always had talked about, but I was sort of actively using. And, Sarah too has taken time off to do research, et cetera, too. So, because you have to kind of, I don't know, feed your soul in a way that's not always about client based projects. And if you don't, I mean, for us, I think it was always that promise of getting to it, but you never really get to it. So I think
Right.
more considered like time off per se. You can call it a sabbatical or whatever, but just to say that making time for it and really honoring it. Plus, it's so fun to do. So it was really easy
Yeah.
to just be like,
Yeah.
it's a little bit of time between meetings. The afternoon looks pretty free. I'm going to run to the library. And, the other great benefit I had for this whole process was being able to work at the New York Public Library and finding out that they had a fellowship program where if you're working with their collection, you can get study room space. So, back when we
Mm-hmm.
were undergrads, you kind of took it for granted that you could have a shelf and whatever. But, having that
Yeah.
within that building too was amazing. And then if you have a book contract, you get put into a different room that's more like a cubby style versus more
Mm.
of a study hall. But that just sort of, I don't know, lent this amazing air of legitimacy to the whole endeavor too. I was like, I'm going to go research. And it was very cool all around. And I think the librarians at every place I went were just so, I mean, obviously helpful, but like, it's just kind of amazing. And I still get amazed. I can just sort of talk about a general topic and they'll be like, well, did you look at this box? Or, I found
Mm.
so many things that, they may not even have known that they had. And it was just amazing relationship and, non-transactional, super helpful,
Right.
always results in amazing things to look at. I mean, you can't really find that anywhere else. So it was
Yeah.
easy to sort of work in the time. to accommodate that process.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mentioned earlier that the studio is very research focused, that research is a big part of your process generally. I remember seeing you and Sarah speak at the typographics conference a couple years ago, talking about the kind of glyphs that you made around gendered pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
You have a whole section on your website called digressions, which are these kind of visual research experiment
Mm-hmm.
projects. um, did that work kind of have an influence on your research process for the book? And then vice versa, did going deep and wide on the book, has you seen that change, kind of coming back to the studio and working? Has that changed your process at all there?
Um, I don't know. Well, first of all, making room for something like collaborative digressions was something we really wanted to do. So, while it looks very tidy now on the website and having done one, we had another one in process before things went upside down. Again, I can't underscore how hard it is to incorporate that extra bit. You have to really mindfully
Yeah.
make sure people are making time for it and sort of keep it on track. So I think there will always be room for that, and that's the kind of practice we wanted to build, is to have time that you can go deep into a topic without necessarily the stress of it being sort of like critic related or school related per se.
Right. Right.
So there's always that bandwidth for that, in that effort. So in a way, yes, ballots fell within that sort of digressive effort. But when it became something that was an actual endeavor, being able to sort of carve out space without ramifications. And again, I can't credit Sarah enough for helping shoulder a lot of the load that the studio work was, forcing on her. So I think it
Yeah.
went fairly well, but I think within that framework, the hope is that we can have room and space for more projects like this.
Do you see that? And I hope this question doesn't sound reductive or like I'm like cheapening, or even commercializing that research. But how do you find that influencing the client work, or does it, or do you see those purely as,
I don't see them.
for yourself?
Oh, well, they are they're independent, but
Right.
you find that you're in this business long enough, you know a lot of people in different places. So I called, was having conversations with different curators in Philadelphia about that, and different friends,
Hmm.
New Yorker tie-in. So in a way, it's very gratifying to be able to speak to people, both professionally and personally, and then add in this side project, and then who knows what can happen. So I think we're very lucky to have sort of fostered this really nice supportive network um, of folks who can help in different ways.
I mean, I'm asking that question somewhat selfishly, and thinking about the evolution of my own practice. And I remember, 10, 5, 10 years ago, 8, 10 years ago, I guess, probably more like, I was working a very kind of traditional graphic design job, going into the office, and then I would come home and work on these other things that were a little more research based or more writing based, or that was like that personal work that you were talking about, of kind of how MGMT started. And I was always frustrated at the time that those felt like two different activities.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in, how do I make these one thing?
Mhm.
Do you have thoughts on that? Or do you see them as two separate things?
Uh,
Or do you even care?
Well, that's yet another question. I mean, when we speak to designers who work for us, who have like really interesting independent projects, we do say, like, if you've done all your work and all the client stuff, and we trust you to be manage your own time, certainly like bring those things into the office. You can work here and not feel self conscious about it, and not have it be an environment where they have to kind of like hide or like clock out.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I think we've always tried to foster this more sort of collaborative spirit, and like sort of creative generation can happen if you're on the clock or not. So in that way, trying to sort of dissolve that those sort of that barrier, or that
Right.
sort of channel of the personal and the professional. Then the other part is like, okay, how do you monetize something that's like personally really fulfilling, that has no like useful value? So I'll let you know when I come up with the answer to that one, because all I can do is come up with like still more of these research projects that basically like aren't making any money. God bless publishers, but I think they need to do more research on grants and that kind of stuff too, because yeah, I haven't figured out that missing link of how to keep personal work more financially viable.
Right. Well, I mean, that wasn't exactly what I was, I wasn't trying to ask you, how to do that, but I do think that that's, I interviewed Rainier DeGraff, who's a partner at OMA,
Hmm.
and he for a while ran AMO, which is their research arm, and basically he said, what this is a way that we can monetize our process or sell our process, without the without the promise of a building coming out of it. It's just like, we'll work with you to kind of figure out and ask these questions, and then maybe something happens and maybe something doesn't. And while I admire that from a kind of business perspective, and also just from a, hey, you get to kind of research and think about things that you're interested in and people pay you for it, um it also feels like, maybe this is just like the kind of like punk rock selling out in me, feels kind of you know cheapening it in some way, and I don't get that with the projects that you are working on, like the gendered pronoun glyph, for example. They seem so just, here's something that we're excited about and we just want to share with you.
I mean, that actually it happened from a client-based project where we were proposing a typeface that was generated by the community, and that the offshoot of
Mm,
that
mm,
was,
right.
oh, what happens if it was for a women's building? What happens if type? So it led to really interesting questions that we were speculating on. So yeah, the origin was on a client-based project, but the client wasn't really funding that endeavor. They were fully
Right.
supportive, but I mean, I applaud anyone who can help incorporate any kind of research process as part of their design fee, which, I'm not saying we do it to sort of fluff the fee at all, but we do it just by nature because we want to learn more
Right.
about the project before we embark on it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of reinforcing that aspect of how research can be more fully supported and incorporated into any project. Clearly, that's always something we try to do. But, sometimes it doesn't always fit. And like, for us, it was trying to balance that financial picture of like maybe you have, well funded projects that can help support time off that's not billable
Right.
for doing research
Right.
like this. So in that way, yes, there is that relationship, even though it's disconnected in other ways.
Right. Right. um I mean, that kind of leads into my next question. What's next for you? Do you think you have another book in you? Are there other research projects? Is there more to this book? What are you thinking about now?
Well, now is a interesting time to ask that kind of thing.
I know.
I think we're all trying to figure out what's going to happen now versus next week versus
Right.
the fall. So, in many ways, not a pandemic versus the election, everything. So, I mean, I feel so grateful to have a working partner in Sarah in terms of just the support and sort of copacetic attitude of everything.
Hmm.
Really, yeah, I have other book ideas in me for sure. And also based on discussions and meetings with different librarians and seeing different collections, there's so much I would love for more people to see. Uh, so, however that can work, is it the collection institution sort of providing some funding to photograph all of it, or how it all there's many different mediums to get those kind of projects out there. But yeah, I mean, maybe another career would be sort of like library collections advocate person, where
Yeah.
show people stuff. It's just because I mean, clearly they're there, and there's a lot of great relationships already, like say at RISD and the Brown libraries. But just sort of the encouragement of like, you don't really have to know what you're looking for. You could just show up at the map collection at the New York Public Library and say, I want to find a map on, cholera distribution, and all of a sudden there is just like a ton of stuff that will be on this table that you just go crazy for, and that's the kind of thing that I would hope to share with anybody else who has sort of a little bit of an itch to research, but still feeling like it's not clear in terms of what they're looking for. So yeah, I don't have fully formed book proposals in my head, but if given the opportunity, I would definitely be happy to do more of that. As well as practice, I still like obviously working and those kind of client relationships. So at this point in time, for sure, it's about like supporting each other, relying on
Yeah.
networks and relationships that the people because it's hard for everybody right now, and so I'm just grateful for what we have and have built.
Yeah. I love the love for libraries and librarians. My mom is a librarian, and that is not something I ever thought that I would do or be interested in. But I actually think if I did my career over, I would seriously consider it, because like what I love doing is just pointing people to things that they're looking for and kind of collecting things.
I mean, it's just so gratifying and like super smart about everything. So I think they're the best people. I was getting way in, like I was going to speak at like a library convention in October. I was just getting way into that group.
Yeah.
And I think it was a fun relationship, because they're like, oh, you're only looking at the sort of visual artifact. And I'm like, yes, but I still care about the content. And so it was really fun, and I hope to pursue that further. So did you read The Library by Susan Orlean?
I have not yet. I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
I liked it a lot.
That is a perfect segue into my final question, which is the question that I use to end all of these. Speaking of libraries and books, what are you reading right now?
Oh, okay. I am reading Eric Foner's Short History of Reconstruction. I could probably email you this longer list, because my side table is nuts. It's like goes from like hardcore like history of debt and economics to a book called Cultures of Voting to Colin Dexter and the Inspector Morse mystery series. So it depends on my mood. Oh, I can also super recommend Word by Word. It's a Merriam-Webster editor writing about being a lexicographer. Awesome. A really fun read. She's a great writer. So again, The Impeachers is another good one by Brenda Wineapple. It's about the trial of Andrew Johnson. So it goes from like hardcore American history to like wordplay to detective mysteries set in different countries.
I love it. That's exactly my side table's the same way. There's no judgment. I love it. This was so fun. I loved the book. I think it's so interesting, and it was so nice to talk to you about it. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
This episode was recorded on August 24th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to vote.